Well, here we are in Dublin. It's January 2009, and we are going to be discussing something of the origins of Academia Europea. We have the great privilege of having here one of the foundation members, Professor David Spearman. He was also the first treasurer of Academia Europea. So I'm going to ask him for his recollections on the founding ideas, the visions on which the Academy was founded, what its progress has been, and what its future challenges seem to be. So David, you're most welcome. Thank you for taking the time to come. And you're the first to be asked. So can you recall the context in which Academia Europea was founded?
Well, and it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for asking me. And I think it's a very appropriate project that you're initiating to try to recap the history and, as you say, the ideas behind the establishment of the Academia Europea. I think what one needs to recognize is that those were early days in relation to the European commitment and the European concept. And where science was concerned, where academia was concerned, I remember I was involved at an earlier stage with the ESF, the European Science Foundation, and I'll come back to that again. But I remember it being said at the European Science Foundation that European academics met each other in the United States. Yes. They didn't meet in Europe. Yes. And that was something that really had to be changed. Mm-hmm. So that was the sort of level we were at. So the world has changed a lot since then. And that was what motivated and led to the establishment of the European Science Foundation. Mm-hmm. And in fact, at the time that the Academia was established, I was actually a vice president of the European Science Foundation. Yes. And I think one would have to say that most of the people who were involved in the early stages of the Academia, possibly with the exception of Arnold Burgeon, who of course was the central figure, but he didn't come into it from the ESF route, but almost all the other people involved came from ESF. So I think first and foremost there was this feeling that we had to create a European community in science. And when science was always used in the broadest sense, in the German sort of sense, the Wissenschaft sense of the word, to embrace humanities, social sciences as well. Yes. And that was so of the European Science Foundation too. Yes.
David, can you recall the year on which the ESF was founded?
It was probably would have been late 70s. Yes, yeah. I know I was appointed. The ESF was involved with organizations, with academies and research councils. Yes. And I was appointed to the Executive Council of the ESF by the Royal Irish Academy. Okay. I know I succeeded Jack Granger in that. Mm-hmm. And I suspect that that was in the about 1980 or thereabouts, and that the ESF had been in operation for perhaps 2 or 3 years. Yes. Brian Flowers was its first president. Mm-hmm. And then I was vice president of it from 83 to 89. Now, if we come to the Academia, I think a key meeting was the meeting of European research ministers, which was in 1985. Okay. And this had been convened by Hubert Curien. And Curien was really a very central figure in the whole thing.
He was the French minister.
He was the French minister for research. Yeah. And Curien was somebody who was very much a scientist of very high standing, who had been drawn within the French system into major administrative responsibilities. He'd been the head of CNRS. Then he was appointed to take charge of the French space effort, CNES. Mm-hmm. And he led on that, and of course that was a spectacularly successful thing. And I think it was through it that he came to know Mitterrand, and Mitterrand developed a high regard for Curien. Mitterrand, in much the way that Napoleon did, liked to take an entourage, including scholars and scientists with him, and he traveled around the world. And so Hubert frequently was with him, be it in China or the United States, wherever he went. And I think he came to know Mitterrand quite well.
Okay.
And Mitterrand held him in very high regard, and so Mitterrand then appointed him as Minister for Research.
I see.
And there's no doubt that he was an extremely influential figure and greatly contributed to the shaping of European research. Curien was a committed European.
Yes.
He was, in many ways one would say he was apolitical in the sense that there was no evidence of his association with any one political party. He didn't sort of think in those political terms, but at the same time he could be effective in achieving his goals.
Okay.
So he really was very much a leader in science in Europe. And when, as minister, he convened this meeting. Now, he worked very closely with the German minister, who was called Riesenhuber at the time. They worked very closely together. And the primary purpose of this meeting, I was there, I'd been invited in my capacity with the ESF. And I remember the meeting very well, but I mustn't digress too much about that. But the primary item on the agenda was to establish a system of research networks.
Yes.
And this was Curien's proposal, and he had substantial support among the ministers.
But the networks would be networks of individual scholars rather than academies or...
These would be networks of individuals.
Yes.
And so it was to introduce a structure which would facilitate and encourage these networks.
Yes.
And of course, subsequently, this has developed. Networks developed through the ESF, networks developed through the Commission programs. And so now networks are a very important part of the framework programs run by the Commission. So all this did eventually come to fruition.
Yes.
But at the time, it was a new idea.
Yes.
And while the debate on this was going on, Peter Brook, who was the British minister,
Yes.
he got up and said, what you really want is a European academy.
Yes.
Now, to my mind, from our agenda, from the point of view of the Academia Europea, one could see that as a positive thing, and indeed it was, because it did speed along the process of founding a European academy. I saw it at the time as probably a somewhat obstructionist intervention on the British part.
Why? Why that?
Well, Britain was not so enthusiastic about European things, really.
Yes.
And particularly if the initiative came from France with the support of Germany, then very often, maybe I'm biased a little bit, but sometimes this wasn't seen as something they wanted to encourage. Yes. And my interpretation at the time of Brooks' intervention, I may be right or wrong on this, but my interpretation was that really it was to try to move interest away from the networks, or just to be somewhat negative.
What strikes me about it is that the definition of science in the continent is slightly different from the definition of science in Britain. And to call it an academy rather than a research scientific council meant that the humanities would be welcome. What do you think?
I don't think that was a factor in it, because the European Science Foundation was very much, it strongly embraced really the humanities and the social sciences.
Yes, yes.
But the fundamental difference was the European Science Foundation was not to do with, it didn't relate directly to the individual scientists. Okay. It was an organization of organizations. Yes. It was made up of the research councils and the academies.
Yes.
And so it wanted to provide a framework whereby the academies and the research councils could operate effectively in concert.
Yes.
And it did this rather well.
Yes.
The academy idea was quite different. It was, the members would be the individual scientists.
Yes. Yeah.
And of course, this had been spoken about before. It was an ideal which everybody would have looked up to and said, you know, it would be something that we ultimately should have. In the United States, you have the National Academy of Sciences.
Yes.
More complicated in Europe because already there were the national academies.
Yes.
And people had a high allegiance to their individual national academies.
Yes.
And even today, people will be torn in their loyalties. In some ways, the National Academy is more important to them than their membership of the Academia Europea. But it's a way of coming collectively and being together, involved together, and getting to know each other within the context of a European academy.
Okay, and at that time, this is pre-89, so the idea of having...
This was 1985.
Yeah,
yes.
so, I mean, the idea of bringing scholars from east of the curtain to meet the people in the West was an important agenda also, was it not?
That was made clear. Yeah. I should say, I mean, if I take the step on then after that, and I'll answer your question in that context, the next step, if you like, in relation to the academia took place in Britain.
Yes.
And Arnold Burgeon was drawn into it at this stage because he was the Foreign Secretary of the Royal Society.
Okay.
Now, I'm not quite sure whether the initiative came from the Royal Society or the initiative came from the government department. The department, I think the permanent secretary at the time was a man called Robin Nicholson. I'm not quite sure. I think that's who it was. So either Robin Nicholson or from the department approached the Royal Society or vice versa. But anyway, together they took this forward. Yes. And the Royal Society set up a committee under Arnold's chairmanship. Yes. To explore the possibility of establishing an academy. And Arnold convened a meeting which was held, I think, in London. This probably would have been about 86. And he had a small group of people there who I think were essentially, or let me check. Yes, Curian was there, also Colombo. Umberto Colombo, who at that time I think wasn't involved with ESF, but he subsequently became a president of ESF. Okay. And there was David Magnusson. Yes. Who was, that you would know. Yeah. A psychologist from Sweden. And there was Robert van Lieshout, who was the head of the Dutch research organization.
Was Torsten Hegestrand at that meeting?
Torsten may or may not have been at that meeting, but Torsten was certainly drawn in at a very early stage. Oh, yes. And Torsten was a member of the first council.
Yes, yes, yes.
So at that meeting, they more or less agreed, these wise men more or less agreed that it would be appropriate to go ahead with the establishment of an academy. And they set down various guidelines, including, as you've just referred to it, that this should certainly extend into Eastern Europe. Yes. So that was clearly stated at the beginning. Although it was recognised there would be certain practical difficulties. There are greater difficulties of travelling, of course, and difficulties of financial contribution and all of that sort of thing. They also decided that the way to go forward was to establish an initial membership. And I think the term foundation membership was used. Okay. And so they came up with a list of, I think it was to be around 100 names. So the initial members were more or less nominated or selected by the foundation members? No, that group that met, yes. They, one way or another, they possibly consulted with colleagues, they looked around, but they said, look, we need a core membership to start off with. And they selected something like 100 names, which I was very privileged to be one. I think that in selecting these names, of course, a primary concern had to be the people of academic standing, appropriate academic standing. But beyond that, I think they were looking in the foundation membership for people who had some European commitment, established European commitment, and known European connections. They felt this would help them at the very earliest stage. Yes.
Did they consult national academies for suggestions?
As far as I know, they didn't. No. But of course, Arnold was the Foreign Secretary of the Royal Society. Okay. Within their academies, they would have consulted, I'm sure. Yes. And these were all, of course, members of their own national academies.
Yes. Okay. Very good. So then?
Next. A meeting of the foundation members was called in Cambridge. Yes. And let's see what year that was. That must have been about 1988, I think. Yes, that was in 1988.
Which was the year of its foundation, yes?
I suppose you could say that.
Yeah.
That was a meeting of foundation members held in Cambridge. And I think there were 52 of the foundation members that attended that meeting. I wasn't able to be there on that occasion, but that you could say that was the founding meeting.
Yeah. Yes.
And then the following year, so things really moved on from that.
Yes.
A mechanism was in place to propose further names. And I think each of the foundation members was encouraged to propose additional names. There was a preliminary, so there was a sort of process of scrutiny for these names. And then in '89, the first annual meeting as such was held in London.
In London, yes.
And by that, I think we were up to a few hundred members.
Yes. That was a foundational year in many ways. It was a dramatic year, politically also.
Well, yes.
Yeah, yes, in '89, yes, my goodness, yes. Well, so the ideas were varied, but they were all designed to promote interdisciplinary as well as international collaboration and joint work. Is that right? Yeah.
I would say very much that the spirit was interdisciplinary, yes.
Yes. I mean, the symbol of academia is the tree. You know, and you kind of think of birds of various kinds coming to nest and be together under the tree. Who designed the symbol? Where did that come from?
I don't know.
You don't know? No, but I think
I should remember at the time. I'm sure I would.
Yeah, but I mean, symbolically, it's very, very powerful.
Yes, it is.
It is
yes,
in terms of creativity and organic connections in the parts.
And of strength as well. I think it's an oak tree. I think.
Yes. Great. So it doesn't have funding capacity. It only encourages, right? Doesn't it, like ESF gives grants for research projects?
Yes. No, the academia would never have seen itself as becoming a major funding organization.
No.
In fact, one of its problems from the very beginning, and I know this very well because at that first annual meeting, at that London meeting, or maybe it was the one at Cambridge that I wasn't at, I think it probably was, I was elected to be treasurer.
Oh, yes.
And I was treasurer then, it must have been for about 15 years or for a long time. And it was, of course, an ongoing struggle to try to keep it afloat.
Yes.
I think we all had the confidence that this was too good a thing to be allowed to collapse. But it was a continuing struggle to have even the sort of the basic money that was needed to keep it afloat. I should say that an administration was put in place.
Yes.
Craig Sinclair, Dr. Craig Sinclair, was appointed as the first Secretary General. Craig had a PhD in physics. He was well qualified. He was a serious professional scientist. But he also had experience of international organizations. He'd worked with NATO, with the NATO scientific program in Paris, and he had a very, very good understanding. He had good contacts within the European scientific community.
What was his nationality?
He was with Scottish.
Scottish. Okay,
yes.
Good.
Craig was from Scotland.
Yeah.
And an Edinburgh graduate. And then we had office support. Teresa McGovern, who was his assistant, so an Irish assistant, and Teresa is the one person who stayed with this administration, is still there today.
Yes.
And then we had Betty and Chunkar. Chunkar Chan looked after the financial side of things, so he kept the books and he worked at the finances.
What is actually the source of funding, apart from individual contributions to the journal and that? What is the source of funding for it?
The primary source of funding has been from one way or another from national, either from national government, from national sources, so either from government in some cases, or through academies, or will typically be national academies.
Yes.
So, and this has been on a very ad hoc sort of basis.
Yes.
So the countries which had significant representation within the academia, if you like, through members, they were encouraged to make a contribution towards it.
Yes.
And they did this. So that was with one source. The other is from foundations, charitable foundations. In the early days, we had support from a lot of foundations. I remember the Nuffield Foundation, for example, the United Kingdom.
Riksbanken also in Stockholm.
Absolutely. I was going to say Swedish foundations, bank, and other endowments. These gave us very good support.
Yes. I was aware of that. I was in Sweden during those years. But tell me now, David, how do you see the progress that has been achieved since then? Because you've been associated with academia since its birth. Has it really achieved the kinds of things it set out to do? To what extent has it done that?
Yes, I suppose you have to ask, what its aims and aspirations really should have been, and I think you also have to recognise what the constraints are. I would say it's achieved a great deal. It now has a membership of several thousands. It's a broadly based membership which includes many, if not most, of the leading academics across Europe. It has a structure through subject committees so that people can group within their own subjects. They can organise activities, programs within their subjects. I think perhaps it's been a mixed success. Some committees, some subject committees have been more effective than others. It's varied a little bit from time to time with this. So I would say, I have to say that in that area success has been mixed.
Yes.
There are many obvious problems for an academy such as this. I mentioned the comparison with the United States, with the National Academy of Sciences. The National Academy of Sciences doesn't really have to compete with individual state academies. There may be smaller organizations, but really for an American, there is one academy, the National Academy. So there isn't a division of loyalty in that regard. And if people are elected to the National Academy, that will be a major and total commitment.
Yes.
Also, perhaps mobility is a little bit easier, and people are more used, and academics would be more used to sort of moving around, and it can take place rather easily. I think there isn't quite the same level of commitment, although people are usually very pleased and honoured to be elected a member of the academia. There perhaps wouldn't be the same feeling of commitment. So it varies who you can draw on to contribute. I think the other practical thing is to draw people together at annual meetings.
Yes.
I found, and you've been to some of them too, I've been to most, I would say, of the annual meetings, and I found these have been very impressive occasions. The academic program has been usually of a very high standard.
Yes.
It's been, you said about cross-disciplinary, it's been very much a cross-disciplinary sort of activity, and a lot of the greatest interest really is across the disciplines. It's the scientists attending things in the humanities and vice versa. So I think they've been very good occasions, but on the other hand, they are unlikely to draw. I haven't really drawn more than a few hundred out of the few thousand of members.
Yes. And in between the subject committees, do they have any resources to meet or to carry on joint activities in between the annual meetings?
Only very modest resources from the academia. Now, of course, there always is the possibility of raising funds from outside sources for specific projects, and this does happen from time to time.
But then it's in competition with, say, ICSU and the other international scientific organizations in terms of subject matter. In other words, if you're a physicist, you're more likely to want to become part of your own physics association of physical scientists rather than an academia group of physicists. Is there tension there?
Well, I think that's probably not any more than you'd have it at a national level. National level, there's membership of your own, here, the Royal Irish Academy, and at the same time somebody might be a member of the Institute of Physics or in geography, you have a corresponding organisation. And I think these are things that people would expect to do. And of course, a lot of the European organisations are different types of structures. I've said about the European Science Foundation being a body of research councils and of academies, so it has a different role. I was for a while a member of the European Assembly, which the Commission set up as a sort of an advisory assembly to it on science and technology. ESTA, that was called. But again, that's a different sort of role.
Yes, yes.
So there are these different bodies, but I think the academy is distinctly defined.
Yes. How would you see the big challenge for the future for the academy?
Well, I think, in a way, I would say it's more of the same. I think,
Yes.
I think there's still some work to be done in building up the membership.
Yes.
But what one really needs to do is to, I suppose, it is important to heighten the profile of the academia.
Yes.
I've met new members who've come along who've been very happy to be members.
Yes.
But some, in some cases, confessed that they had never heard of the academia.
Yes, it's
until
not
they
very
were
well
elected.
known. Yes. It's really
It
not.
should be better known.
It should.
It
really
should have a higher profile.
Yes,
And I think that would help.
Yes.
And I think then somehow to encourage members to a fuller, a more active participation.
Yes, yeah. I was also curious about the rationale for academia as opposed to ESF in terms of research orientation. Was there a position at the beginning about applied versus pure research, as it were? You know, if you look at what Commission and EU projects are like, there's an insistence on societal relevance, and this is becoming more in the philosophy of ICSU as well, that science should be at the service of society. But as you know, the traditional view in science was that it should not become too much involved in public affairs, that it should be, you know, lab-based, objective, and so on. Was there a discussion on that at the beginning of academia?
I'm not so sure that there was a specific discussion, but it would have been part of the thinking. The fact that the commission activities and commission programs,
Yes.
the fact that these were really very much applications oriented.
Yes.
They were concerned with economic consequences and so forth.
Yes.
And this was a legitimate position for the Commission and for the EU to adopt. I think that underlined the importance, and it would have applied to the ESF as well, of looking to basic research,
Yes.
which wouldn't really get the support through the Commission. That's changed to a certain extent
Yes.
in recent years. So I think ESF itself was very much committed to basic research.
Yes.
And there's no doubt that the academia looked to scholars doing, you know, what they wanted to do. It was certainly research knowledge for its own sake. This was very much at the heart of it. It's not opposed to work which has can produce applications benefit, but it was certainly the advancement of knowledge in the broadest sense.
Yes.
Like I would say, most of the academies that we're particularly familiar with.
Right. Yes. That does make the interdisciplinary challenge a little bit tougher, because in a sense, even if you look back at the Liverpool meeting, it was because of these, in a way, largely because of its societal relevance of the topics that were discussed, that physical scientists and humanities and social scientists had a common denominator of interest, as it were. You know, but if each goes for the basic knowledge of his or her own field, it widens the gap between that field and other fields, does it not? Or it could, at least.
I don't think this has been my experience. I think it depends very much on the community you find yourself within.
Okay, yes.
And I think I've seen this in an academy like our academy here in Ireland,
Yes.
of modest size, which gives the opportunity for people to know each other and to
Yes.
form a community. Then I think it's through personal interaction that ideas can
Yes.
be transferred.
Yes.
And at least it facilitates the transfer of ideas. I think it's more difficult with a body as large as the academia is now.
Yes, yes, yes.
But I think this is what we want to try to facilitate.
Well, I'm sure if others do as much or even half as much as you have done already, David, you know, we will be advancing on that road. I agree with you totally that the building up of a community is vital for cross-disciplinary mutual understanding, and people sharing not only their knowledges of their specific field, but also their life experiences and the role of knowledge in society. So thank you very much for coming and sharing these ideas with us. I'm sure that many of the subject group leaders will find this piece of history to be very instructive. Thank you very much, David.
Thank you, Anne.
Good.